Welcome to the IISS this afternoon for our talk and discussion on India-US relations. For the benefit of the audio recording that is taking place, my name is Rahul Roy Chaudhary. I am the Senior Fellow for South Asia at the Institute. The India-US relationship has undergone a paradigm shift in just over a decade from a period of concern over the US role in South Asia to one of potential strategic partnership. The bilateral civil nuclear deal in October 2008 has been the high point of this relationship between India and the US, which took place in the administration of the then President George Bush Jr. The relationship under the Obama presidency does not appear to have fared so well, possibly because the game changer in the relationship had already taken place, even as its implementation remains slow. India's Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh will be meeting US President Barack Obama in Washington later this month to try to boost the bilateral relationship. But what can realistically be expected as India's general elections loom large amidst critical regional security challenges and new interlocutors on the US side, including National Security Advisor Susan Rice, Secretary of State John Kerry, and Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel? To discuss this and related issues, I am delighted to welcome to the IISS KP Nair, or KP as he is better known. KP has been the Washington-based Chief Diplomatic Editor and Correspondent for the Americas for India's Telegraph newspaper for over a decade, and is one of the most knowledgeable, incisive, and influential commentators on India's diplomacy and foreign affairs. I'd also like to take this opportunity to recognize in this audience Dr. Virender Paul, who has recently arrived in London as the Deputy High Commissioner of India to the United Kingdom, and Dr. Paul earlier served as a minister at the Indian Embassy in Washington. So I look forward to Dr. Paul's comments if you wish to do so during the discussion session. Could I now turn to KP for his introductory remarks? Thank you.
It's a great honor for me to be invited to speak here, and thank you all for coming, because Rahul told me that the working season at IISS really hasn't started and that it will start only on September 12th. So officially, assuming that officially IISS is still on a sort of holiday, I thank you all for having come before the session starts. For me, the honor of being invited to speak here is complemented by the fact that Rahul is chairing this session. Rahul and I go back a very long time. We first met in Oxford many decades ago, and proof of that is my grey hair, which Rahul doesn't have, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how he looks at it. But after that, when we both moved back to Delhi, Rahul was my neighbor. We were neighbors for many years in Delhi, and then nowadays whenever I want to write on Navy, I take the liberty of ringing up Rahul and consulting him, and I'm very, very pleased that he is now recognized as one of the leading international experts on maritime matters. Actually, I am a little humbled in being asked to speak about this subject, because Dr. Virender Paul is actually a better expert on Indo-US relations, having been directly involved in the process, both when he was minister at the embassy in Washington, and before that at the nerve center of everything in the Prime Minister's office, especially during the time when the nuclear deal was being negotiated. So in many ways he is better qualified to speak on this subject than me. In any case, I don't intend to go over the whole gamut of Indo-US relations, which many of you know well about, because it has been one of the most transformational relationships of our time for students and practitioners of diplomacy. So I would prefer instead to concentrate on some of the anecdotes which are not in public knowledge, in the public domain, which I have come across during the long years that I have covered Indo-US relations, which is the reason why I don't really have a prepared speech. Instead, I brought my various reporters' notebooks, which is for a journalist, it is the best reservoir of information. When Rahul and I were discussing the title for today's talk, I was in two minds, whether we should use rice and Kerry diplomacy, or whether we should just stick to rice diplomacy, because actually rice is very crucial to Indo-US relations, and in my estimation, the one person who has singularly contributed as an individual more than anybody else to the transformation in Indo-US relations was Condoleezza Rice, when she was National Security Advisor to President George W. Bush first, and later on as Secretary of State. And she really was the pivot of changing the relationship in many ways. And now that in the United States, in my years of reporting, I find that in much more than in any other country, in the diplomatic setup, one person I find is prepared to go a long way, push changing the relationship. Another example is William Burns, who is now the Deputy Secretary of State, who was earlier Undersecretary for Political Affairs. He was ambassador to Moscow. He was actually the man who really pushed the reset in US-Russian relationship. Unfortunately, because of other factors, succession of factors, the latest of which is the Snowden incident, the reset really failed to take off. But no, he did quite a bit, and Condi Rice was like that for Indo-US relations. And I am quite sure that in the remainder of President Obama's presidential term, the person who is going to really be the pivot of Indo-US relationship is going to be Susan Rice. I mean, having dealt with her during the years when she was in her previous job, when she was permanent representative at the United Nations, in the United Nations, as most of you know, it's only the resolution or the Security Council presidential statement, PRST, which people remember, but the negotiations that goes on behind the scenes, the lobby talks, that it really it doesn't get into the public domain. And it's amazing, having had sort of a ringside view of the 2 years of India's membership of the Security Council. It's amazing how much Susan Rice contributed to India and in the United States working together in the Security Council. There are many instances. A landmark incident was when a terrorist attack took place in Bombay, and every time an incident like this takes place, the Security Council, there is a PRST, the presidential statement, and it's one of those things about big power play, that there are two kinds of PRSTs when terrorist attacks takes place. One is when, like Beslan or September 11 here, the presidential statement outright condemns what happened, and there's a standard format, like many things in the UN. It condemns the attack. But whenever an attack of a similar nature takes place in a third world country or in a developing country, the statement is different. Like when there was the Bali bombing, or the previous attacks in Bombay, the presidential statement, the presidential statement that is reserved for the non-P5 countries, it of course condemns the attack, but the next sentence advises these governments that they should be conscious of human rights, and that in dealing with such situations, human rights should be protected and democracy should be upheld and all that. And the Indian permanent representative at that time, Hardeep Puri, told Susan Rice that we are not going to accept this statement. We want the other one, which applies to P5. And some of the P5 countries were hesitant, including Great Britain. And Susan Rice had no hesitation in pushing this. And this was the first time that the Security Council issued the standard P5 statement to a third world country, and there was no reference to human rights, there was no reference to anything else, just outright condemnation. So I can recall many instances like that. So it is my belief that in the next 3 years Susan Rice is going to be the main mover of this relationship, which is why I was in two minds whether it should be Rice and Kerry diplomacy or Rice diplomacy. But when Rahul agreed that it should be Rice and Kerry, being a journalist who likes catchy headlines, I gave in myself that Rice and Kerry diplomacy was better than Rice diplomacy. On Indo-US relations, Rahul referred to the transformation, but there has been this perception that India was before the end of the Cold War, India was not enthusiastic about the kind of relationship that it now has with the United States, that the Cold War perceptions prevented the two countries from coming together. But Jawaharlal Nehru actually wanted a robust Indo-US relationship, but he wanted it within the framework of his own worldview, which of course was not practical given the situation at that time. But Mrs. Gandhi, contrary to what a lot of people think of Mrs. Gandhi, she was like Margaret Thatcher in many ways, perhaps more of an iron lady than Margaret Thatcher herself. Mrs. Gandhi wanted very strong Indo-US relations, and she did. It is not very well known that she did try very hard, and she was frustrated, and one example of her frustration was she went to the Nixon White House, and she was so fed up by what Nixon and Kissinger told her and how they behaved with her, that when the standard Rose Garden press conference, she came out with Nixon, and there are these standard two questions from each side which are asked at the Rose Garden press conferences. So the first question was asked by an American journalist, and Mrs. Gandhi was so fed up that she replied in French. And there was no translator, and she didn't warn anybody that she was going to speak in French, and most of the American journalists did not understand French. So the second question came, and again she replied in French. The question was in English, and she replied in French. That is Mrs. Gandhi for us, But when Ronald Reagan became president, it changed. She tried again. And they met in Cancun in 1981, and what was supposed to have been one-on-one, there was only one person present on the Indian side during this meeting, and my information comes from him. He's no more there. His name is Ganju. He had no official position, but he was a Kashmiri, like Mrs. Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, and in those days Kashmiris ran the country. The foreign secretary was a Kashmiri, the ambassador in Moscow was a Kashmiri. So Ganju, my information comes from Ganju. And Ronald Reagan, the meeting lasted 45 minutes or something, and Ronald Reagan talked most of the time. And Mrs. Gandhi, very strange and unusual for Mrs. Gandhi, she listened patiently to Reagan, and Reagan was giving her a lecture, And at the end of the lecture, Reagan told Mrs. Gandhi, Madam Prime Minister, if you want to change, if your country is to develop, if the people of India are to get out of their poverty, you must pull yourself up by your bootstraps, So that was the first time Mrs. Gandhi spoke, and she told the president, Mr. President, in order to pull ourselves by our bootstraps, first we have to have boots. So after Indira Gandhi came Rajiv Gandhi. Rajiv Gandhi was extremely keen on better Indo-US relations. I mean, he was really in many ways the modernizer of India, like he brought computers to the country on a bigger scale. But unfortunately, Rajiv's prime ministership was blighted by the Bofors corruption scandal, other problems. So, as you all know, he was a one-term prime minister, and he got so weighed down by domestic problems that he couldn't do much in Indo-US relations. The next prime minister, it was actually during the next prime minister's time, P.V. Narasimha Rao, that everybody thinks of the nuclear tests and the change in the relationship since then, but it was during Narasimha Rao's time that the relationship actually began to change, and it changed with what is known as the Kicklighter proposals. Lieutenant General Claude M. Kicklighter, who was commander of the Pacific Command, PACOM, he was the one who unveiled this visionary paper about changing Indo-US defense relationship, and I would say that this was the starting point of a paradigm shift in relations, And then, of course, to fast forward, the nuclear tests took place, and then following the nuclear tests, there was the dialogue between the External Affairs Minister Jaswant Singh and Stroop Talbot, who was President Clinton's classmate at Oxford. The widest range of consultations ever in Indo-US relations took place during that period. Of course, in between Reagan's time, after Mrs. Gandhi, the meeting with Mrs. Gandhi, actually India and the US signed a science and technology agreement which paved the way for use of technology which was otherwise prohibited for India. The United States wanted to sell anti-tank missiles to India for the first time. The sale, of course, did not take place. But the Jaswant Singh Stroop Talbot dialogue really started on the nuclear tests, but it went on to cover virtually everything. So much so that Prime Minister Vajpayee, when President Clinton visited India, described India and the United States as natural allies. In India, the term caught on, but President Clinton was obviously not willing to go that far. And then in the following year, 2002, actually, our neighbor, Rahul's and my neighbor, Brajesh Mishra, who the legendary Brajesh Mishra, who was Principal Secretary to the Prime Minister and India's first National Security Advisor. When the history of Indian foreign policy is written, his role will be very, very, very major, in fact. And I have it from the late Brajesh Mishra that he actually proposed something like the nuclear deal to the Bush administration, which had come in by then. And Mr. Mishra said that we didn't hear anything, nothing, not a word, not even an acknowledgement. And then suddenly in 2003, Condi Rice came up with this next steps for strategic partnership, which was announced by President Bush when he was in Mexico and Vajpayee simultaneously in Delhi. That, as many of you may know, is the precursor of the nuclear deal. And even then, there was no reference to what Brajesh Mishra had proposed. But suddenly, when Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was in Washington, 2005, the day before the meeting between the President and the Prime Minister, Condi Rice drove to the then External Affairs Minister Natwar Singh's hotel room and proposed the nuclear deal. Well, I won't go into the more recent history of Indo-US relations because it's very recent and it's fairly well known. But I will again fast forward to the Prime Minister's upcoming visit at the end of this month. The visit is to a very large extent an Indian initiative, because the Prime Minister is very keen to reinvigorate, to give a new vigor to the relationship because of this perception, as Rahul mentioned, that not much has happened during President Obama's second term. So the Prime Minister is very keen, and he wanted to see what could be done by having another summit with President Obama. And so to a very large extent it is an Indian initiative, but it is a testimony to the relationship that although the United States normally does not encourage people who go to the UN General Assembly to come to Washington at that time, otherwise many people would want to hop across from New York to Washington. But in the case of India, an exception has been made, and the President and the Prime Minister are meeting on the 27th morning, after which he will go to the UN General Assembly. And of course, apart from the review and everything, both sides have been looking for something not quite on the scale of the nuclear deal, but something that would be a symbol of the relationship, about how it is going to go forward. And my expectation is that permission to export LNG will be one of the elements that may come out of that visit. India is very keen on buying LNG from India, but United States until very recently had restrictions on selling LNG only to treaty allies. But now one port in Louisiana, Sabine Pass, is allowed to export LNG, but that's the only place from where LNG is allowed to be exported to non-treaty countries, and there are several countries. Not non-treaty, non-FTA countries. Free trade agreement. India doesn't have a free trade agreement with the United States. So there are other FTA countries, and they use this Sabine Pass. So it's very difficult. India would join the queue last, and it is the expectation, from what I can make out in Washington, that before the Prime Minister arrives, at least one or two more terminals will be given permission to export LNG. The other thing that is likely to happen is the defense relationship. As many of you may know, the Americans are pretty cut up that Dassault Aviation got the deal for the 126 multi-role combat aircraft, which is the 126 planes. It is the biggest military aviation deal in the history of mankind, and the Americans were very upset. In fact, the day after the American companies were disqualified, the US ambassador in New Delhi resigned the very next day, because he had given President Obama the impression that the deal would go to the Americans, and the very next day he resigned, and since then there have been intense consultations on defense between the two sides, and the previous defense secretary nominated the deputy defense secretary Ashton Carter to iron out the problems in the defense relationship. There are many, one of which is the ITAR regulations, which prohibit the sale of state-of-the-art technology to non-NATO countries, and that was one of the considerations for not giving the MRCA deal to the aircraft deal to the American companies, because we were only getting second-rate avionics because of these restrictions. So So President Obama had assured the Chinese that these export control regulations will be reviewed, and Ashton Carter's brief is to try and find a way out of these regulations, and my understanding is that his 1 year long negotiations with the Indian National Security Advisor Shiv Shankar Menon has resulted in some major announcements that are likely to be made on defense, on how to circumvent these regulations. There is also, I am told, a unique proposal under which defense equipment would be loaned to India, so that this is, I'm told, unprecedented. Where now most of the Indian material is Russian or Israeli. So the idea is that the Indian forces would try out these equipment, see how it fits in, and then move into buyer-seller sort of thing. But if this actually happens, the volume of trade, the defense trade will go up very much, and one of the things that Obama is very keen on generating more jobs in the United States with US orders is likely to fructify. Rahul had told me about 20 minutes I have exceeded my time, but I look forward to questions, if any, and we could talk more on this at that time. Thank you very much for your patience.
Excellent. Well, thank you, KP. I think you've added tremendous flavor and style to the bilateral, to our understanding of the bilateral relationship. Let me start by asking a question on the defense side of things that you raised, and you started with the Kick-Lighter proposals, and most recently we had a sense that that 2 out of the 3 sort of possible outcomes of the next Manmohan Singh visit to Washington would be on technology and again on defense matters. To what extent is there the sort of the elephant in the room that is China in the relationship, in the talks between India and the US on defense matters? Because in a way there's always been a sense for both countries, officially Delhi and Washington, to say, well, China really is not part of that, of sort of, the perceived need to strengthen the defense relationship, but other observers see it as a key element. And I think in Delhi, in the last 15-16 months, I've sort of seen a sort of shift on that position, where India's position towards China is tougher because of what's happened across the line of control in the recent few months. So to what extent is the relationship with China going to, for both countries, and the bilateral relationship that India has with China and that the US has with China, going to make an impact on the future of the India-US relationship?
Compared to the period from the 60s to the Clinton visit, when the phrase hyphenation came into vogue on Indo-Pakistan relations vis-a-vis the United States, since the nuclear tests, 1998 nuclear tests, I would take the view that there is a degree of hyphenation, India-China vis-a-vis the United States. And certainly during Prime Minister Vajpayee's prime ministership, and I'm sure it's true perhaps to a lesser extent during Manmohan Singh's prime ministership, India has very cleverly played the United States, the US card vis-a-vis China. And yes, there was this famous incident where after the nuclear tests, the Prime Minister wrote this letter which was leaked to the New York Times about China, and George Fernandez, the then defense minister, describing China as the number one enemy. And during the early part of Vajpayee's prime ministership, the relationship was troubled, the relationship with China. But I am told that the moment the Clinton visit was decided, the Chinese ambassador in New Delhi sought a meeting with George Fernandez, whom the Chinese were running down, and he had described China as number one enemy, and the Chinese don't usually take very kindly to this. But the Chinese ambassador, and then of course George Fernandez was part of the Tibetan thing, right? The Tibetans used to stay in his house, the Dalai Lama's people. So, but the Chinese ambassador, it's a testimony to the pragmatism in Chinese diplomacy, which is the post-Mao thing, right? So he sought a meeting, and as you said, George Fernandez went to China. So it's my sense that in the last decade at least, the Indo-US relationship has definitely a weight on Sino-Indian relationship. I wouldn't say it is equally true. The reverse is equally true. But I mean, this is not a subject that we are covering today. But since you referred to the border incidents, the Sino-Indian border, it is my view as a journalist that the problems between China and India are much more in the press than in the media than on the real ground. I think the real ground, the ground realities can be managed, and I think it is being managed. And the former External Affairs Minister S.M. Krishna once told me after his visit to China that Yang Jiechi told him that why do we lose sleep over the border? In the last 40 years, not a single shot has been fired across the border between India and China. So yes, we have a dispute which is a legacy of history, but the border situation is not something we have to worry about. So a lot of it, I fear, is in the media rather than on the ground.
Thank you, KP. It's the floor is open for questions, comments. I'd be grateful if you could identify yourself and ask a question or make a comment. Yes, please.
Vinod Kumar, member of this institute. Rahul described the paradigm shift in Indo-US relationship. To what extent do you think that paradigm shift changed the Nehruvian view of Indo-US relations? And why was it that there's been a kind of a low key in Obama's first administration in Indo-US relations? What are the challenges there? First of all, what's the paradigm shift, the nature of the paradigm shift, and what are the challenges that have been there the last 5 years?
Indian foreign policy has been changing. You refer to the Nehruvian foreign policy, but in terms of pragmatism in foreign policy, the policy has been changing, particularly since Narasimha Rao became prime minister. A lot of things changed. I think the most dramatic shifts in Indian foreign policy have been during Narasimha Rao's time. And Narasimha Rao in many ways jettisoned some of the baggage of Nehru's foreign policy in terms of ideology, the opening up to Israel, the establishment of full diplomatic relations with Israel. That is a fascinating story actually about how it came about. The opening up to Southeast Asia, I mean, Indira Gandhi's time, there was an approach for us apparently. It's not been, there's been no historic document to prove this, but many people who have worked in diplomacy at that time say that if India wanted, India could have been a member of the ASEAN at that time. But apparently Indira Gandhi's reaction was that why should I sit with these tin pot dictators in Southeast Asia, and I mean it was a big mistake, I mean those economies became tigers. So Narasimha Rao again started the Look East policy. The outreach to Japan, which Manmohan Singh has carried through. I mean, otherwise, India's relationship with Japan has traditionally been an ODA relationship, Japanese money for development projects. But now it covers so many things, including the nuclear things, right? And so Indian foreign policy has been gradually changing. And what is the second part of your question?
But I was actually referring you to the paradigm shift in Indo-US relations, not the change in Indian foreign policy towards Southeast Asia or Israel. So what was the nature of the change in Indo-US relationship, and what have been the challenges recently?
Oh yeah. The shift, I mean, it has been amazing. I mean, there's no comparison to what Indo-US relationship has been earlier to what it is now. The range of activity, for example, it covers everything, I mean everything from civil nuclear cooperation to health, homeland security, cyber terrorism. There's nothing that is really not covered, I mean the Food and Drugs Administration has an office in the American Embassy now. But perhaps one single incident, single example that would illustrate the change in the relationship is that some years ago the FBI opened an office in Delhi. There was a time when, my God, the idea of an FBI office in Delhi would have raised hackles and red flags would have been all over, and nobody even mentioned it, the defense relationship, I mean, when the Marxists were ruling West Bengal, for example, in near Calcutta, there was a air exercise, and these air exercises are great fun. I mean, for people who are, especially people who don't see these kind of aircraft. So the ruling party, the Marxists, they organized a demonstration against these air exercises, and since it was the state government, they allowed the demonstrators to approach the area where the exercises are held. And these demonstrators actually came to demonstrate, and they were gawking, they were enjoying the sight, the exercises, and it actually turned out to be a non-demonstration, So I think these two examples are probably typical of the change in the relationship.
Desmond.
Desmond Bowden, IIS member. You talked about the relationship in the Security Council, particularly between the representatives there and Susan Rice and her influence. I just wonder whether you'd say something about the development of that, the diplomatic relationship. And I remember that there was a moment, a really important moment, I guess 5 years or more ago, which actually wasn't in the UN Security Council, but it was in the IAEA board, when India voted against Iran in a way which, as it were, hadn't been traditional. And I wonder what it is that's expected in terms of the development of this US-Indian relationship, and what the US might see as being India taking its responsibilities, when on the Security Council, and that's not all the time, but maybe in the future it might be, and the extent to which, for example, over Syria, there might be an expectation that the Indians would, as it were, side with the US rather than take an independent line, and the extent to which there's this kind of pressure from Washington on Delhi to shift position from an aligned stance to something which is more, as it were, aligned with the West. I mean, is that a problem in the relationship?
at the United Nations, it's very tricky. It's India has to do a lot of tightrope walking, because India is probably the only country in the world which only significant country in the world which does not have a group of its own. The Southeast Asians have the ASEAN, the Europeans have the European Union, Latin America has various things, CARICOM, Mercosur. The only thing that India is in is SAARC, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, and more often than not, SAARC is a forum where India is the whipping boy. So actually, non-aligned movement is the only thing that India has, which is probably the reason why a number of talking heads in association with people like the National Security Advisor Shiv Shankar Menon, former Foreign Secretary Shyam Saran, who was Prime Minister's Special Envoy until recently, they put together a new document on non-alignment, redefining non-alignment and all that. And non-alignment is extremely important for, the non-aligned movement is extremely important for India in the United Nations. For instance, not much attention is now being paid to the Security Council reform. But in my experience of covering the United Nations for the last several years, especially intensely during India's membership, it is the idea of Security Council expansion is moving inch by inch, little by little. It is a long way to go, but it is not stagnant. It is moving. And when a letter was submitted, for years, there was this open-ended negotiations, which was really open-ended. It was not going anywhere, And 2 years ago, a letter signed by 142 countries was submitted to Zahir Taneem, who is the chair of the Intergovernmental Negotiations, appointed by the General Assembly President on Security Council reform. So 142 countries signed this letter for text-based negotiations. Open-ended, it was really open-ended, as I said. But this led to an actual text on Security Council reform, and now there is a text which has gone through several revisions and all that, and the bulk of this 140 are non-aligned countries, and it was India, Brazil and South Africa which went round and got these votes. And supposing India had jettisoned the non-aligned movement, this text-based negotiations would never have begun, and in fact there is this group, another group called L69 in the General Assembly. L69 has actually given notice for a resolution on Security Council reform, which gives somewhat, it has not been put to vote, partly because of uncertainty in certain capitals whether they would get the necessary vote. But I think in my opinion, this L69, if the government's the group of four, G4 would have the courage to put it to vote, I think it would pass, and 2/3 is necessary in the General Assembly. But of course, that doesn't mean India is going to get membership. So non-aligned movement is very crucial for these reasons. But I think during our membership of the Security Council, we were able to balance its commitment to the non-aligned group, to commitment to being a responsible member of the Security Council, and it was very much in evidence on a number of issues. For instance, piracy where India played a major role in the Security Council group on piracy because India's own interests there, and I think India was able to work together with the P5 very closely on piracy. Then on counter-terrorism, in fact, the Indian PR was the chair of the counter-terrorism committee, CTC, of the Security Council. So a lot of entrenched positions, I think, on terrorism India was able to influence a change in the nomenclature and descriptions. Then on Syria, India was misled into supporting one resolution, but the second resolution, I'm told that false promises were made about military intervention. And the second resolution, of course, India did not vote for. But I think learning from that experience on Syria, India was very cautious. And it is my understanding that India was able to influence, particularly working with Susan Rice, the language of at least one Syrian resolution, and because of the language change, India voted for that. Second resolution, India was not. So I think that we are progressing in that direction. On Iran, for example, I think the IAEA vote was largely determined at that point by the desire to push through the nuclear deal. It was at a very crucial point in 2006, I think it was. I don't remember the exact year of and if India had not demonstrated its commitment to what the West calls responsibility on Iran's nuclear program, the nuclear deal may have got stuck. So I would say that it was more of a one-off thing, And again, on Iran, I think India has taken a very pragmatic view lately, because, for example, when some of these think tanks sent a delegation to Delhi, including former US ambassadors to India, they also had a rare meeting with the think tanks with the National Security Advisory Board. And the advice that India gave was, you in Washington, you control your rhetoric on India, and we will moderate our actions, because the view was that if there is too much rhetoric in Washington, Parliament will be angry, there will be more pressure, India will become more stubborn, there will be, at the end of the day, there is a Shia vote in India, vote bank, especially in Uttar Pradesh, Lucknow, particularly the former Prime Minister's constituency. So I think the advice was taken, that rhetoric should be moderated in Washington, and India will moderate its actions, which was reflected in the decline in oil purchases and things like that. So I think, to answer your question, it has worked well.
Let me take the last three questions together because we're running out of time, but we Antoine and Professor Jasani and Kerry. Antoine.
Antoine Lebec from the IISS Research Analyst. We mentioned hyphenation with China. To what extent does this operate also with Pakistan? So how could
can you say that again?
Sorry, hyphenation with China. So to what extent does the India-US relationship, to what extent might it be responsive to US-Pakistan relations, maybe in the context of Afghanistan?
Should we just take the other and then we can...
Sure.
Professor Jasani.
Bhupender Jasani from King's College London. You mentioned that the nuclear deal hasn't really progressed very much since it was first conceptualized. I wonder whether part of the problem on the Indian side is that the nuclear program has been so intertwined with the civil program that it has been hard. Actually, one of the criteria was that there should be an international inspection available. Now, I remember I visited some years back Bhabha Atomic Energy Research Center, and I visited all the other facilities where isotopes are being produced, etc., etc. And then I passed by one building and I asked, "What is that?" And he said, "You're a British national? Stop conversation." That was, in fact, was a plutonium production plant. Now, you see, this is partly a civil facility, and yet there was a plutonium production plant right in the middle of that. And I wasn't to know anything about that. There was no discussion. Now, I wonder whether that problem is still pursued. Because I was asked some while back, actually, can you write something on entangling the civil and nuclear, and the military nuclear, and see how the safeguards can be applied? Because this is one of the problems you have, that part of the dual nature of nuclear activity, and then how do you separate all that? And I think this may be one of the problems which India had, that how do you do that? Yeah, it's fine, Tarapur reactor is good applied to safeguards there because it's just a power production plant. But when you come to Bark or when you come to other facilities in the south, it's going to be hard. And that's part of the reason. How do you do that? Second problem, I feel that India also may still apprehensive, and coming back now to my own pet topic of recent pet topic on space. You had the problem of India not being able to get the cryogenic engine technology. Of course, now it's developed its own, and now this is one way of getting around to some of these problems. India launched an American satellite on one of its rockets. Now, this is unthinkable. 10 years back, it would not have happened because of the problem of transfer of technology. Now, there are some of these avenues that might be explored, and I was wondering what your views are on that. Thank you.
Kiran.
I'm Kiran Hassan, I'm from the Double Headings. My question is an extension of Antoine's in the context of Pakistan. Since we have Kerry's diplomacy in the kind of so I was wondering what kind of role, not only in context with Afghanistan, but in context with MFN status vis-a-vis India, how much of a role is Washington likely to play in the upcoming months in vis-a-vis Indo-Pak relations? Not necessarily through the prism of Afghanistan, but through the prism of the region, basically.
Do you want to go into all this and then we close?
Yeah. Okay, we have got 7 minutes, is it? Yeah. Let me take the nuclear deal first. It was not I who said that the nuclear deal is stuck. It was Rahul who said that the expectations have not been
implemented,
not
fully.
been fulfilled.
And that was in terms of the whole issue about in Parliament. The restrictions that have been put across in Parliament on supplies, nuclear supplies, problems with to look at U.S. Supply for nuclear energy. Those are the related issues. But
But I tend to agree to some extent with that perception, because not enough progress has been made on civil nuclear cooperation with the United States, but not with France and Russia. They're going apace, and the problem really is with the United States, because as many of you know, in the United States the lawyers come into everything, and if the nuclear deal is the setting up of nuclear plants in India by American companies is trouble free, the lawyers have no jobs, lawyers don't make any more money. So they have gone into the nitty-gritty of the nuclear liability law. They have persuaded American companies not to go in for operations under this law. The observation about the lawyers is a light-hearted thing, but there is a problem for American companies under the nuclear liability law, and I don't see the Indian Parliament being persuaded to change the nuclear liability law, because even the current version of the law was arrived at with a lot of negotiations among political parties. We have so many parties. I think the ruling coalition has 24 parties, and then there are the opposition coalition. So it was a miracle that the nuclear liability law was passed in its present form, and I don't see that changing. And unless the Americans can find a way of working under this law, it is difficult for the nuclear deal to make progress. At the same time, both sides are very keen that they should keep up the pretense that everything is going forward. So before one of the visits, I don't remember which one it was, the Indian government announced the allotment of land, which would give the impression that it is going ahead. And before Kerry came for the strategic dialogue, they signed something unique. Westinghouse and GE on the one hand, and NTPC, Nuclear Thermal Power Corporation of India. Normally what they do is early works agreement. Early works agreement is what starts the process. But in India, the American companies have signed something called pre-early works agreement, So, and then Kerry announced that along with Salman Khurshid, the Indian External Affairs Minister, that September has been kept as the deadline for the early works agreement. But I don't see that happening during Prime Minister's visit, as far as I know. But sometimes miracles happen. But as far as I know, yes, there is a problem. But on the military civilian thing, I mean, Virender would be the expert actually. The process has been complete, I mean, the separation of military isn't it, Virender? The separation of military establishments from the civilian ones has been thoroughly completed. Without that, the United States would not have approved the 123 agreement, because under the US law, for the 123 agreement, it was necessary to do that separation, and it was completed by that time. On hyphenation, I mean, looking at it from London, I think it is. For somebody in London, I think it is very difficult to understand the de-hyphenation of the relationship, because in the UK, I think it is still in many ways hyphenated for a variety of reasons, including the domestic political compulsions and the feeling that whenever I deal with British diplomats or when I visit the UK, this feeling that I get, that, I mean, I don't say it in a bad sense. The idea that Britain still owns South Asia, that we know best, So, I mean, as I said, I don't say it in a bad sense, because, there's so much of expertise, there's so much of history, there is this wealth of knowledge. So I think it is difficult for the United Kingdom to dehyphenate the relationship, unlike the United States, which has been able to do so. And I can give one typical example of this is when Gordon Brown was making a farewell call to President Obama. In the course of the conversation, I was told on background this. By the Americans, that Gordon Brown told Obama that you should do something about India-Pakistan relations. You have influence with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. Something really should be done to solve the Kashmir problem and improve the relationship. And President Obama's reply apparently was that I know Prime Minister Singh so well, and nobody is doing more than Dr. Singh to improve the relationship with Pakistan, and he is committed to improving this, and he wants it to be his legacy that he has done something on India-Pakistan relationship. And when there is a Prime Minister like that, what more can I do? He is doing much more than anything more that I would be able to persuade him to do. But the idea that there is again a hyphenation in the relationship is in some ways created by track two people rather than in the government. On Afghanistan, yes, India, I think, has some difficulty in comprehending the idea that the United States actually needs Pakistan for Afghanistan, and this need will only get worse. Putin has been very clever in Central Asia. The last American base in Manas in Kyrgyzstan will close in April, I think, next year. And once Manas is closed, they are solely, totally dependent on Pakistan for supplies. The option is Iran, and India has on various occasions been advising the United States on certain things the United States could do vis-a-vis Iran, But I think there are problems in Washington which Obama is not able to deal with. I think the Obama administration, in my view, wants to do something about Iran, but pressure from the Jewish lobby, various other things. It's very difficult. So America's need for Pakistan will only deepen as 2014 approaches. But I don't think that the relationship is any more hyphenated, like it was for almost 50 years.
Well, KP, on that note, we must end. We've gone beyond the session time, but I think it's been a very instructive discussion and the talk that you've given us. The bilateral relationship between India and the US is clearly a global one. I think that is the bottom line, that it is a global relationship. We've talked about some aspects of regional security, but there are others. We'll see what happens when the Indian Prime Minister visits Washington later this month, and then we'll see how that relationship actually is able to progress through a transition of elections in India and a new government. But as you've clearly put your cards down on the Rice factor, on Susan Rice, who was actually, we were at university together. And I think that's something that we'll see how that plays out. So thank you very much, KP.
Thank you, Rahul. Thank you.